Hello everyone. Did you know that 80% of those who watch my videos have not subscribed? If you enjoy these stories, I'd truly appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel. Also, don't forget to leave a like and tell us your thoughts in the comments. It really helps the channel grow. Thank you for watching. Eight months passed before I took another job. I needed the time to recover, to convince myself I could handle it, to process what I'd seen at Widow's Watch, to stop checking my email every morning for photographs of that tide pool. But my brother was diagnosed with stage 3 colon cancer, and the medical bills were piling up faster than his insurance could cover them. Chemotherapy, radiation, experimental treatments, the costs were astronomical. When they offered me double pay for a rotation at Beacon's End in Washington, I couldn't refuse. Family comes first, even if it means going back to the isolation, back to the places where reality bends. The Lighthouse was newer than the others, built in 1952, and it showed. The structure was concrete instead of brick or stone, with actual rooms instead of just open floors connected by spiral stairs. There was a proper kitchen with a gas stove and refrigerator, a bedroom with an actual bed instead of a cot, even a small bathroom with running water from a rainwater collection system that was surprisingly efficient. It felt almost civilized, almost normal, like a small apartment rather than a prison of isolation. The walls were thick, insulated, keeping out the worst of the cold. There were real windows with intact glass, not just the small portholes I'd grown accustomed to. The station manager who briefed me seemed relieved I was taking the job, almost grateful. He kept checking his watch, as if worried I might change my mind before we finished the paperwork. "We've had trouble keeping people here," he said, sliding the contract across his desk. "Nothing dangerous, just uncomfortable. The previous keeper lasted his full rotation but said he wouldn't come back. Turned down a bonus to stay for another cycle." What made him uncomfortable? He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. He didn't specify in his official report, just said something about the radio room. Said he couldn't sleep knowing it was up there. When I pressed him for details, he just shook his head and walked away. The radio room was on the second floor, a small space lined with equipment mounted on metal shelves and bolted to the walls. Most of it was modern, digital systems for weather reporting and emergency communication. LED displays, touchscreens, satellite uplinks, everything you'd expect in a contemporary maritime station. But in the corner, almost hidden behind a filing cabinet, sat an old radio. The kind they used in the 50s and 60s, a massive piece of equipment by today's standards. Vacuum tubes and analog dials, a microphone on a coiled cord, the whole thing covered in a thick layer of dust that suggested it hadn't been touched in decades. There was a note taped to it written in hasty handwriting on yellowed paper that was curling at the edges. "Don't use the old radio after dark." I asked the station manager about it when he came to see me off, but he just shrugged and looked uncomfortable. Previous keeper's note. Probably just superstition. The old radio doesn't even work anymore. No power connection, no antenna. It's just there for historical purposes. We keep meaning to move it to a museum, but it's never been a priority. The first week was quiet, almost boring. I fell into a routine, did my work, read my books, listened to podcasts on my phone while the beacon rotated overhead. I slept soundly for the first time in months, no nightmares about wet footprints or faces in dark water. It was the easiest rotation I'd had, peaceful in a way the others never were. I started to think maybe I'd overreacted to the previous experiences, that maybe the captain at Harrow Point had been right about isolation playing tricks on your mind. Maybe Widow's Watch had just been a particularly bad episode, a combination of stress and lack of sleep, and too much time alone with my thoughts. On day 8, the power went out. It was 1:37 a.m., and I woke to complete darkness, the sudden absence of the refrigerator's hum and the beacon's motor. The silence was absolute and wrong. The backup generator should have kicked in automatically within seconds, but it didn't. I lay there for a moment, listening to nothing, then grabbed my flashlight from the bedside table and went to check the breaker panel on the first floor. That's when I heard it. The old radio in the radio room had turned itself on. Static at first, loud and harsh in the silent building, then a voice cutting through. Distorted, desperate, with the characteristic warble of old analog equipment. "Station 7, this is the Mary Catherine. We're taking on water. 4 crew aboard. Requesting immediate assistance. Our position is 48 degrees north, 124 degrees west. We are sinking." Repeat, "We are sinking." I ran to the radio room, taking the stairs 2 at a time, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly. The old radio was glowing, its vacuum tubes lit up bright orange despite having no power connection, despite being disconnected from any electrical source. The voice continued, giving coordinates, describing their situation in clipped, panicked sentences. The boat was sinking. They were taking on water faster than they could pump it out. They needed help now. The captain's voice was raw with fear and desperation. I grabbed the modern radio and called the Coast Guard, my hands shaking as I adjusted the frequency, gave them the coordinates, relayed the distress call word for word. They acknowledged immediately, their response professional and efficient. They said they'd launch a rescue boat immediately and asked me to maintain contact with the vessel to keep them updated on their status. I went back to the old radio, leaning close to the microphone. "Mary Catherine, this is Beacon's End. Coast Guard has been notified. Help is on the way. What's your current status?" The voice responded, but it was fading, growing weaker. The captain's voice, strained and desperate, describing the water rising in the engine room, the boat listing 20 degrees to starboard. I could hear other voices in the background shouting, the sound of water rushing, metal groaning. I could hear the fear in his voice, the desperation, the knowledge that they were running out of time. I stayed on the radio with him, trying to keep him calm, telling him help was coming, that they just needed to hold on a little longer. The Coast Guard called back 2 hours later. I'd been pacing the radio room, listening to the old radio, hearing nothing but static for the last hour. Their voice was carefully neutral. "Beacon's End. This is Coast Guard Station Nia Bay. We've searched the coordinates thoroughly, multiple passes with searchlights and thermal imaging. There's nothing there. No boat, no debris, no sign of any vessel in distress. Water's calm, visibility is good. There's nothing." "Are you certain about those coordinates?" they asked. I checked my notes. I'd written them down exactly as the captain had given them, double-checked them before calling the Coast Guard. "Positive, 48 degrees north, 124 degrees west. We've been searching for 2 hours, extended the search radius to 5 miles in all directions. There's nothing here. Are you sure you heard a distress call? Could it have been interference from another station?" I went back to the old radio. It was still on, still glowing with that eerie orange light, but now there was only static. I tried to call out to the Mary Catherine, pressing the transmit button, speaking clearly into the microphone. "Mary Catherine, this is Beacon's End. Please respond. What is your status?" But there was no response, just the endless static, crackling and hissing. The Coast Guard called again at dawn. "Beacon's End, we're calling off the search. We've been out here for 6 hours. There's no vessel in distress. Whatever you heard, it wasn't real. Probably interference from a recording or a training exercise from another station. But it was real. I'd heard it. I'd heard the panic in the captain's voice, the fear of men who knew they were going to die, and I'd recorded it on my phone while relaying the information to the Coast Guard, thinking I might need the exact wording later. I pulled out my phone and played back the recording. My voice was clear, asking questions, giving reassurances. "Mary Catherine, help is on the way. What's your current position?" But the other voice, the captain's voice, was just static. Meaningless noise, the sound of dead air. On the recording, it sounded like I was having a one-sided conversation with nothing, talking to myself in an empty room. I sat there, staring at the old radio, trying to understand what had happened. The vacuum tubes were still glowing faintly, pulsing slightly, like something breathing. Then I remembered the note taped to the equipment. "Don't use the old radio after dark." I searched online for the Mary Catherine. It took some digging through maritime accident databases and historical records, but I found it. A fishing vessel that had sunk in 1967, almost 60 years ago. Lost in a storm off the Washington coast. Same coordinates I'd given the Coast Guard, down to the exact degree. 4 crew aboard, including Captain Robert Voss, all lost. Bodies never recovered. The wreck was never found, lost somewhere in the deep water off the continental shelf. The old radio was still on, still glowing. I reached to turn it off, but before I could touch it, the voice returned. The same voice, the same distress call, word for word. Station 7, this is the Mary Catherine. We're taking on water. 4 crew aboard, requesting immediate assistance. I backed away from the radio, my heart pounding. The voice continued, repeating the same message over and over, never varying, like a recording stuck on loop. I went to the breaker panel and cut power to the entire radio room. The lights went out, the modern equipment shut down with electronic beeps and clicks. But the old radio kept going, still glowing, still broadcasting, running on nothing. No power source, no connection, just those vacuum tubes burning orange in the darkness. I found the logbooks that afternoon. I'd learned my lesson from the previous rotations. Always check the logbooks. They tell you what you're really dealing with. I found entries from multiple keepers over the decades, all mentioning the same thing. The old radio turning on at night, the distress call from the Mary Catherine, the Coast Guard finding nothing. Some entries were clinical, others were desperate. All of them showed the same pattern of disbelief, investigation, and eventual resignation. One entry from 3 months ago stood out. 3rd time hearing this call. Can't do this anymore. The captain sounds so real, so scared, but he's been dead for 50 years. Requested early extraction. Can't take the guilt of not being able to help. Another from 2 years before that. The voice sounds so real, so desperate. But it's been dead for 50 years. How can something dead still be calling for help? How long does a distress call echo? How long does someone keep calling out into the void? I spent the rest of my rotation avoiding the radio room. I kept the door locked at night, pushed a chair under the handle for good measure, but I could still hear it, faintly, through the walls and the locked door. The same distress call, over and over, a voice that had been calling out for help for 60 years, never getting an answer, never stopping. Some nights I'd wake up and hear it clearly, as if the captain was standing in my room, calling out those same desperate words. When my rotation ended, I filed my report. I mentioned the power outage, the equipment malfunction with the backup generator. I didn't mention the Mary Catherine. What would I say? That I'd heard a ghost on the radio. That I'd sent the Coast Guard on a rescue mission for a boat that sank before I was born. They'd think I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had. But I still hear it sometimes. Late at night when everything is quiet in my apartment. That desperate voice calling out, asking for help that will never come. And I wonder how many keepers have heard it over the years. How many have tried to help? How many have realized too late that some calls can never be answered? That some voices never stop calling, never accept that no one is coming, never understand that they're already gone.